Hi everyone, and welcome back to our series of short lectures on how to write your term paper or master's thesis for the program on East Asian economy and society, or shortly EcoS, at the University of Vienna. Today we are taking kind of an intermediary step between uh, determining your topic, research question, relevance of that, and actually moving to the literature review, like, actually reading. I have one slide on structure of literature review also in the literature review presentation, but experience tells me that maybe I should have a separate one on how to structure the literature review to help you not just getting started, but also being more efficient in your work. So this will be the topic of today's talk, the structure of the literature review. We will start, as usual, with a reminder on the structure of the whole thesis or term paper, just to tell you where we are standing in this process. Then the question of what is this good for? So why should you actually think about the structure of your literature review before starting to read? I mean, why not just reading and then determining what to do after that? Well, I will really try hard to use one example on how to actually do this. These examples are always kind of a difficult thing because they are just that, examples. And as I will also tell you later again, they might not really be totally related to your research, but hopefully, if you look at them in a more abstract way, they should nevertheless give you an idea. Okay, so you remember our basic structure: theoretical part, empirical part, analytical part. We are in the theoretical part. We are between the introduction and the literature review. So you are now actually thinking about how to structure this section number 2 of the theoretical part. Why is there a need to structure the literature review? This is what I would like to start with. Please remember, and I really mean it, the sole purpose of your whole term paper or master's thesis is indeed to answer your research question. I know that sounds a bit limiting, and you might think this is kind of restricting your academic freedom and your creativity. Yes, it is. But look, this is a task that you have to fulfill as part of the EcoS program. You don't want to spend forever on it. And if you want to explore areas related, if you want to go beyond your narrow research question, perfectly fine. You are more than free to do so. But then on the other hand, please consider you want to graduate on time, you want to finish this seminar on time, depending on what kind of paper you are writing. And efficiency is really the key word. It will really, really be very important that you stay focused. And this is what this is all about. So, answer your research question. That's the whole thing. That's all you need to do. Nothing more, nothing less. Therefore, every element in your term paper or master's thesis should serve that function and only this function. The literature review, as you will also see in the next presentation, is the foundation for your analytical framework, which is another word for your plan to answer your research question. So all these steps are kind of logical and consecutive and in a causal relationship to each other. And therefore, it's self-evident that the literature review must be directly related to your research question. And as I just said, to nothing else. And that's why I have these 3 exclamation marks here. I do know that sometimes students, don't really know what to do, don't know how to start, and reading feels good, right? It feels like you're doing something, and then you will hopefully find many interesting things. So it's really easy to actually get carried away by stuff that you find that might not be so related to your research question, but first of all, you found it, so why not entering it in your paper or thesis? It will help you filling empty pages, and that always feels good psychologically. And you can show me how intellectually developed you are, etc. Please don't do that. It is not helpful. You will need your space later on, and filling space, filling empty pages with stuff that is not helpful, is not a good idea. It just feels like a success, it feels like progress, but it really is not. Stay focused, please. The literature review must be related only to your research question and to nothing else. Anything that is interesting but that doesn't fit in, save it for later, but do not continue reading about it. Do not put it in your paper. You have only limited amount of space for a term paper, and you only have a limited amount of time for your master's thesis. As I said, you don't want to spend 20 years researching it. I mean, you're free to do so, but usually, students want to graduate, and please keep that in mind. I can't really repeat that often enough because I've witnessed about 200 master's theses over the years, and I don't know how many hundreds more of term papers, and it's always this problem of losing focus that many students really struggle with. Okay, so you need to have a structure of your literature review that will repeat itself a couple of times. That's why it's also a very efficient thing to think about. To think about the structure of the literature review, you don't just do that for one part of your paper, but actually for the whole thing. You will find the same structure in your analytical framework. You will find the same structure, of course, in your empirical part, which is based on the analytical framework, as well as in the final part where you really analyze all your results and draw your conclusions and discuss them and so on. So all that follows the same structure, and that structure emerges really from the research question. Okay, so you connect your literature review to the research question by structuring it. You avoid reading and writing too much and about things that are not really relevant, even though they might be extremely interesting. And you lay the foundation for all the other essential parts of your term paper or master's thesis. That's why structuring your literature review properly is such an important thing to do. Okay, how do you do this? Well, in a way, it's relatively simple because you will arrive at a point in consultation with me or with your instructor, depending on what course we are talking about. You will arrive at a point where your topic and title are clear, where your research question has been discussed and understood and maybe adjusted. So research question is clear as well. You also have clarity about the relevance of your research question, like what it's good for, who it's relevant for, who would benefit how and why from knowing the answer to your research question. So you are at the point where you actually pretty much know what you want to do and where you already have read a little bit that will help you making a more informed decision. Right? So we are at this point not only at the very beginning, but already you are way into the process of writing. You do have sufficient information actually to make that decision on how to interpret, how to deconstruct, how to break down your research question into a number of issues that are logically connected. So once you've done that, you can start looking for literature on each of those issues and only of those. This will, as I mentioned before, help you to stay focused and to search for literature more specifically, like you know what you're looking for. And that means a more efficient use of your time and energy. As I said, an example will follow with all the restrictions placed on it because it's just an example and it's actually something that I made up. So it might not really feel like it's directly related to your research, but then every research project is different, and therefore, of course, an example can never really be 100% precise in terms of telling you what to do. But we will discuss that. Don't worry about it. We will discuss the structure of your literature review so that you can feel safe before you start actually reading. Also, at this point, I would like to remind you of the book by Kate Turabian, which you will have read in one or the other course, and we usually discuss it, where she talked about the storyboard that she recommends students to draw. Now, drawing, I think, is not really meant literally, but it's more about having a story and narrative that consists of elements that are more or less logically connected to each other, and where you see that you have a consistent story, so there isn't any element missing. And the structure of a literature review, I think, is also in a way such a storyboard. The nice thing is it's usually relatively short, so you can still have an overview. If you have a document of 10 pages, it's really easy to lose track, right? But if you have your structure of a literature review on, let's say, half a page or so, it's much easier to see, is there really a consistent narrative? Is there something missing? Or does it at least look as if it is a complete story? All right. Now here's my example. I apologized already a couple of times for it being a bit outlandish, maybe compared to someone who wants to write about the conflict in the South China Sea, or about, I don't know, the labor market in South Korea and Japan, but I think you got my point. So my example is, again, the smartphone models, and the research question I am asking is, which of two smartphone models, iPhone 13 or Samsung Z Flip 3, shall I purchase, right? The structure of a literature review would look a little bit like this. I suggest you really make a table, because that forces you to be structured, and it forces you to be precise. And you will notice that it's not so easy. You know, it's much easier to hide behind many words, but as soon as you're asked to create a list of bullet points or a table, you're kind of forced to be more transparent. And that is a nice tool to help yourself to be honest to yourself, right? Okay. The first column, you just have brief points, definitions, features, price, battery, and so on. In the second column, you have more of an explanation, where you can add a few words, comments on what you mean. Many term papers, many literature reviews of term papers and master's thesis will typically start with definitions. Now, remember that a definition is, of course, serving a purpose, so it's not for showing off that you are able to find 10 different definitions. I always, after reading all this, expect actually that you determine which definition you actually want to use. Strangely enough, students very often forget about that. So I have like, oh yeah, there's this definition, but there's also that definition. And then they move on to the next section, and I think like, okay, but it's good to let me know which definition are out there, but which one are you using, or why have you written about definitions in the first place? The point is to get a clarity, right? As Confucius would say, rectification of names. Yeah, you do not have to start with definitions. Do not regard this as a prescribed structure, please. It's an option, and I think it's an option that will be relevant for many of you, but not for all of you. It really depends on your research question. Okay, now if you compare to, let's say, in that case, smartphones, but again, it could be two healthcare systems, it could be two labor markets, it could be reactions to a financial crisis, it could be strategies in a conflict, or whatever it is. You know, the range of topics at EcoS is very diverse. If you compare something, you need to find criteria for your comparison, and usually these follow certain features of the problem that you have. Now, in my case, we talk about comparing smartphone models, so the next question is, which features, which characteristics can smartphones have? And in this particular example, I think this will be the most extensive part of my literature review, and of course a necessary element in the structure to look at what has been written, said, and whatever about characteristics of smartphones, right? And here you have a number of examples. In this case, I also decided to add, as you see, price, battery, and there will be a few following on the next page, features that I found in this first part, because they also need to be discussed. It's not enough to say, okay, I found that price matters. In the literature review, once you've found that this is amongst the most important features of a smartphone, of course you would have to read about, okay, what does price mean? What is a good price? What is a high price? What is a low price? Does it include or exclude value-added tax, and so on and so on? Or for other examples, of course, these might be other features and they will have other characteristics, but very often it's also about measuring these elements. So you identify a certain feature or characteristic for your comparison, but still you don't really know what kind of data to look for your empirical part. So are you looking at GDP numbers, or are you looking at number of employees? Are you looking at, I don't know, certain formulations in legal regulations, and so on and so on? So that also needs to be discussed, and therefore it also becomes part of the structure of your literature review. Okay, and then you see the same thing follows for a number of other pretty obvious characteristics. I have two more points here. If you go a bit further down on this slide, other features and ranking of criteria. Other features means that you might eventually come across characteristics that you have not found during the first part of your literature review, so of course you have to add them. And also ranking is always a bit of an issue. I usually discourage my students from working too quantitatively unless you are really absolutely certain. So assigning like values from 1 to 10 to certain characteristics in social sciences, sometimes very, very tricky, happens arbitrarily, and is a subject of a great debate and diverts people's attention away from your actual research question. You can use qualitative criteria like present or absent, or yes or no, or strong or weak or something. But again, this needs to be discussed, and I think, again, depending on your research question, such a discussion should be part of the literature review. Like, how have other people approached the problem of a possible ranking of criteria? Like in my example, obviously I have all these features that a smartphone has, but it's also obvious that some are more important than others, and that's a discussion of can I really determine at least a ranking in importance, or maybe I'm even able to quantify that, and if so, what does it take? Now, again, we are still talking about the structure of your literature review, so you need to be aware of the tasks you then have to fulfill in your actual literature review, right? So this is kind of a preview to what you are actually planning to do. All right. To conclude, as usual, we talk about a systematic approach. A systematic approach. We try to limit the element of randomness to an absolute minimum, okay? Because we are talking about research here. We are not journalists. Nothing wrong about journalists. It's just they often take a different approach. And we are also not explorers of the 17th or 18th century who ventured into the unknown and then excitedly described what they found. You know, like all these youngsters, yeah, it's fascinating if you look at the age at which some people boarded a ship. Usually sons of aristocratic families went to Southern America, went into the rainforest and started describing what they saw, and they are now celebrated as great researchers. They were not researchers. They did this descriptive research. What we do is analytical, right? So we start with a question to answer, and we develop ways to answer that question. And then we apply this approach to the actual case, and this is how we draw our conclusions. This is your task. The literature review will lay the foundation for that. It will lay the foundation for all the elements of your term paper or master's thesis, and therefore it needs to be geared 100%, nothing less, nothing more, towards this one goal, okay? Answering your research question. You will save a lot of time if you think hard about the structure of your literature review before reading. You will be able to focus your energy really on your task. And I think this is really important because term papers, and of course even more so master's theses, are quite an effort. And you usually don't have much energy and time to waste. So be efficient. And I also wanted to remind you of this image of a storyboard from Kate Turabian, which I find extremely useful. Where do you want to go? Why? What do you expect to find? What do you look for? Etc. Needless to say that the actual story will look differently. Of course, you will come across things that you didn't expect. And since you only submit your thesis or paper after it's done, you can easily go back and forth between the elements and supplement them. So the structure of literature review is kind of a starting point for you before you start reading. It's not like a limitation, right? If you find that you have been missing or overlooked elements, or you were not aware of elements that are important, perfectly fine, then you can focus on them. But it's much better than just starting to read randomly without any aim, because that very often will lead you off track and into frustration and waste of time. Okay.